Hello, and welcome to the Dotacast podcast, the one true chapter by chapter podcast going through A Song of Ice and Fire one chapter a week. I'm one of your hosts, Jeff, better known as Brenda Beefish.
And I'm your other host, Emmett, better known as Poor Quentin.
And welcome to the 152nd episode of the Dotacast titled The Dark Knight Rises. Yes, another great title, knockout. An analysis of A Storm of Swords, Jaime 1, in which Jaime Lannister, of course, proves himself to be unquestionably, is this correct, Emmett? The greatest point of view in all of A Song of Ice and Fire and of any story in all time.
2 episodes back from hiatus, folks. 2 episodes back, and he's already determined to be wrong. Got to give him credit. That's determination.
Yes, indeed. And we are joined by a special guest for this episode, none other than returning special guest, none other than Shiloh Carroll. Welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for coming on. We had such a great time with you, just doing a solo episode with the two of us, and now we got all three. What could be better?
That was a great episode. I really enjoyed the episode on medievalism. It was such a blast to listen to. Among all the episodes, I enjoyed that one. I enjoyed everyone equally great. They were all equally great, or equally great. But that one touched my specific interest because I was as a history major, I did a lot of medieval studies specifically. So I was very attuned to what you were saying. So I was A+, thumbs up, great job.
Thank you.
Of course. As always, this episode is brought to you by our not a small council, our Hand of the King, Wolfman Zach, Grand Maester Tim Bob, troubleshooter of systems and designer of circuit boards, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Mark N., Sir Keith J., Master of Whisperers, Lord Philip the Merciful, Master of Laws, Archmaester June, Healer of the Lesser Poxes, Ragan Michael, Ward of the North, Nelson Hammer, Prince of Dragonscone, Scarlet the Other Red Woman and Mistress of Whisperers, Lord Micah, the Quilled Lion, Ward of the West, Herald the Golden Tooth, Master of the Banefort, and the Kraken's Bane. Lord James, the Gem that was promised, Lord Jake Assistant to the Hand of the King, Lady Zena of Valyrian, Sir Jack, Lord of Sir Arthur Dane, and Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, Sad Prophecy Boys Club, His Grace's High Inquisitor, Sir Frank B., Lawrence, Prince of Dorne, Kelly, Ward of the East Bishop of Old Bay of Crabs, Stephen the Steadfast, Master of Hounds, the Blue Winter Rose, Knight of Highgarden, Lady Stephanie, Lord Carlos, Lord Andrew the Restless, the Priest of the Drowned God, Sir Sorcidelica, lost my place, Sugar Stent, the Troglodyte Warrior, Lord Penchant for Nostalgia, Queer Alex, who has chosen a brand new title, as we announced last week, for A Storm of Swords, which is, of course, Queer Alex, Beyonce's favorite stan, Herald, Cher, and Bastard of Chromatica, Exalter of Black Lives and Defender of Trans Lives, Rainbow Commander of the Ladies and Gentle M's, and the Notacast, non-binary Nota Army. Love that title. Holliver, the Way for T-Bow, A.A. Ron Damphair, Prophet of the Forsaken and High Priest of Euron Crowseye, Lieutenant Glenn, Lord of H-Town, Veneris of House Colgarian, the First of her name, Princess of Dragonstone, Mistress of Art, the Overworked, Queen of the Pencils, the Eraser, the First Draft, Queen of Monochrome, Devotee, the Great Game of Thrones, Fortress of the Realm, Lady Realist of the Seven Kingdoms, Blood Her Paints, Maker of Drawings, and the Michelangelo of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Lord Adam T., Lady Alexander of Tarth, Sir Christoph Logus, Bloody Scorpion of the Red Field, Defender of the Letter of Kent, and the Wolverine of House Corgoyle, Lady Elizabeth, Mistress of Horse, Face, Lesbians, Sir Josh Snow, Bastard Bounty Hunter, one more time, Sir Josh Snow, Bastard Bounty Hunter of the North, Surveyor, Chief of Parties in the Frozen Wastes, Lord Peter, the Dead Shepherd Reborn, Preacher of the Poor Fellows, Marshal Harrison, absent shipwrecked in the Jade Sea, Grave Rob Stark, the Cadaver King, and Horror of Harrenhal, Olaf, establishing a feudal, pseudo-democratic system of great councils where every count votes, Sir Tim, the Knight who's guided by voices, Lord Nick, Thucydides, Lord of Plagues, Sir Jack, Lord of Sir Arthur Dane, and Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, Sad Prophecy Boys Club, Part 2, Lady Anna, the Lovely Castellan, Pat Iron with the Blood Row and Guardian of the Bone Blade, Luke, Lord of Lone Leaf and the Pillar of Autumn, Joe Snow, King of the North and Protector of the Tri-State, Squire Matt S., Future Matt S., the one who will bring balance to the kingdoms, Lord Kyle, Lord Samuel Seaworth, Sir Max, Lord Commander of the Constitutional Guard, Lady Ivory Dane, aspiring noble author in the Seven Kingdoms, Lady of Starfall, Wardeness of the South, and the patron of freewheeling bisexuals, Lady Jamisa, she who suggests that coconuts migrate, Lord Christoph of Arendelle, official ice master and deliverer, the valiant, pungent reindeer king, keeper of icy pants, and prince consort to his ginger sweet love queen Anna, Lord Sir Septon Brothers, Sir Grizzly Adams, the King's Justice, Ward of the Kingswood, and Sheriff of the Seven Kingdoms, Sir Kell, contractor in charge of continually extending the small council table, and returning back, actually has been around for a while. I just kind of fucked up putting it back on the list because he's been a patron of ours, the small council patron, for a while. But returning back is Lord Travis, Master of Ships and War of the Waves, Captain of War Galley, Night Wolf, the ship that stalks the seven seas, and wielder of the Valyrian steel trident summoner, the blade that brings the deep ones. Whew. Welcome back, Lord Travis. Sorry again for not having you on the list for our small council patrons. Thank you to you, and thank you to all of our small council patrons.
Thank you to all our small council patrons, as always.
And all our spoiler warning. As we say in every episode, we'll potentially be talking about all published books. That is the 5 novels, 3 Duncan novellas, histories, interviews, the Winds of Winter sample chapters, as well as Game of Thrones TV show. Anything and everything.
Our question this week comes from Queer Alex, Beyonce's favorite stan, Herald of Cher, Bastard of Chromatica, Exalter of Black Lives and Defender of Trans Lives, Rainbow Commander of the They/These and Gentle Thems, and the Not-A-Cast's non-binary Not an Army, who asks, I'm so excited to reach the midpoint of the published material. I feel like Storm is not only the midpoint of the series, but also a breaking point in the narrative as the relatively singular narrative explodes after this book. So my question is a bit of an open-ended one. If you were in George's shoes, or his editors, and you were going to change or alter any details of Storm to make an easier to conclude series, what would you change? Would you delete characters? Skip Marine? Have the Red Wedding fail? Continue with the 5-year gap regardless? How would you approach editing this pivotal book to still be strong, but also not create a narrative that is so hard to complete? And that's a terrific question. What do you think, Jeff? How would you come back to Storm in such a way that would make Feast and Dance kind of easier to write?
So that's the thing. So this is a really hard question to answer because originally George's idea was that the characters would age up naturally and you'd have an Arya chapter here, and then 3 months later you have Arya 2, and the characters would grow up, right? So he's at this point in the story where he's writing and he's thinking, okay, this is going to go great. I have this great idea. The characters are all going to be, Bran's going to be 17 years old by the time I get to A Dance with Dragons. And no, that shit just did not happen. It did not work whatsoever for A Song of Ice and Fire. So George's next solution was, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do a 5-year gap, where I'm going to end A Storm of Swords and then push the narrative 5 years forward to the next book, which of course was A Dance with Dragons, which we can get all into this stuff. We've talked about it many, many times in the past. So how to make this like congruent with the actual thing as it evolves, since George eventually abandons the 5-year gap and ends up writing the story chronologically after it occurs. I think you probably want to somehow age up the characters a little bit, because if that was the big deal to begin with, you'd maybe want to have some of these chapters occur a little bit wider apart chronologically. In terms of like edits and features that I would kind of like move out of like A Storm of Swords, and we're going to talk about this when we get to the Arya chapters, but man, those first couple Arya chapters they're not bad chapters, okay? They're not bad chapters, but they're a little redundant and a little kind of unnecessary to the overall plot progression and arc for Arya. I think you want to probably get her speeded onto her eventual journey in Bravos going forward, probably by the end of Storm of Swords, although I think the way that she ends Storm is lovely and great. I think, would I skip Marine? No, I think Marine is really important for Dany's story, specifically because it's important for her to learn that, conquering is really kind of fucking fun, right? It's fun to be like, to go in there and like wipe the floor with a bunch of fucking slavers, like every day. Like, I would love to have that job. But then when you find out that she's in Marine, she finds that actually this sucks a lot. Like, I have to do things I'm not really enjoying doing. You realize that there are consequences to that kind of kick-ass action-y moments from A Storm of Swords, which really sets up her arc in A Dance with Dragons. I think the Red Wedding, I get it, like Robb and Catelyn, everyone loves Robb and Catelyn, but they have to die in the story for A Song of Ice and Fire to make sense. I speak hard truths only, but I speak them out of love for everyone. I think that the Red Wedding is both seminal to A Song of Ice and Fire, but it's also really sets up the remaining events from the story. But I've talked long enough. Shiloh, how are you going to improve A Storm of Swords? Because you were actually a published author, unlike myself, who, despite having many accolades, has not been published yet, professionally at least.
Yet. We need to emphasize the yet there. As a fiction writer, I would simply not write a series. That's how I'm getting around it. I look at the idea of writing a trilogy and go, nope, just not going to do it. Standalone
Very
books
sensible.
all the way. He really has worked himself into a position where, since stuff's already out and you can't back up and you can't fix stuff, man, I would just have a panic attack and die. in his position, honestly. Everybody gets all down on him for write it faster, George, and I'm like, God, man, he's really in a corner here, and I do not blame him at all for how long it's taken to do this. I don't know how I'd fix it.
Yeah, because as much happens in Storm, there's also just storylines we don't check in on, like the Ironborn. We only hint at the Dornish. We only hint at what's going on in Essos, and he leaves himself a lot of wiggle room, and then he took full advantage of that wiggle room and then some. I mean, like, part of me wants to be brutal and say just, like, get rid of Stoneheart. As awesome as Stoneheart is, she still hasn't paid off in Feast or Dance. Like, no, I mean, I love it when Catelyn comes back. I think it's one of the most amazing moments in the story. But if you're going to be brutal at making Feast and Dance easier to write, be done with the Riverlands, I guess, because they don't matter as much as the north of King's Landing to the end of things. And, you know, I think the Ironborn, I think if I'm right about Euron, you kind of have to still have them around because he turns out to be kind of important. The Dornish, he should have just written them as important from the get-go so we didn't have to spend so much time catching us up on them. And like Shiloh says, there's just it's too late with that. So yeah, I sympathize. I think there are some things that are a little bloated in Feast and Dance, where I guess you can change a chapter here, a chapter there, but that doesn't change the overarching problem, which is that he just ripped up the game board so completely in Storm that all he could do for the next 2 books was stitch it back together. It's just a testament to how crazy shit gets in this book.
And you know, it's crazy to me too, like not just how crazy like a Storm of Swords gets, but how George follows it up with even better books after a Storm of Swords, right? I mean, we have the debate. Obviously, people are going to endlessly debate, but in our seemed correct opinion, you know, Feast and Dance, I think, are improvements despite the fact that he's like remaking the entire series as on the fly almost. And of course, when I say on the fly, of course, over the course of 11 years, making, you know, Feast and Dance into one series.
And I love all that stuff. I love the Stoneheart's material we've gotten so far. I love the Ironborn and Dornish material we've gotten so far. But, you know, this is why George is it's become just a nightmare scenario, because he has to launch these fresh plots off the ground while also wrapping up all of the main characters and introducing the young Griff stuff. So, you know, there's nothing he can cut that won't inspire outrage, and that again is just a testament to how good it is. It's just too much of a good thing, unfortunately. A Song of Ice and Fire.
In writer speak, this is why I'm not a pantser, because you end up with this kind of a mess.
Alas. Well, thank you, Queer Alex, for the question that we did our best to answer. If you want to ask us questions, we'll answer here in the Not-A-Cast podcast. You're welcome to become a Sworn Sword or higher level patron over at patreon.com/NotAcastASOIAF, where you can also get show notes, bonus A Song of Ice and Fire and pop culture and Fever Dream episodes, free merch, access to the Not-A Slack, and more. So check us out again at patreon.com/NotAcastASOIAF.
Yes, indeed. And, you know, the Fever Dream episodes, we're going to start them up again. We're recording our next episode on Chapter 20 this week. So if you are a patron, it is going to be coming your way relatively shortly. So check your feeds for that. And for all of our $5 and above a month Poor Fellow and Above patrons, our next bonus episode, of course, will be an in-depth analysis and look at the 2008 animated film Waltz with Bashir. Again, this episode will only be available to our Poor Fellow and Above patrons. So come join us at patreon.com/NotAcast, ASOIAF. But enough about Patreon. When we last checked in with, we've never actually checked in with Jaime Lannister before. But I guess when Catelyn last checked in with Redemption Man, that is AKA Jaime Lannister, she had questioned him and got mad online when the blonde god talked some shit back to her. She ordered Brienne to bring her sword. Let's find out the outcome of all of that in this synopsis of A Storm of Swords, Jaime 1. An east wind blew through his tangled hair, as soft and fragrant as Cersei's fingers. He could hear birds singing and feel the river moving beneath the boat as the sweep of the oars sent them toward the pale pink dawn. After so long in darkness, the world was so sweet that Jaime Lannister felt dizzy. I am alive and drunk on sunlight. A laugh burst from his lips, sudden as a quail flushed from cover. Quiet, the wench grumbled, scowling. Scowls suited her broad, homely face better than a smile. Not that Jaime had ever seen her smiling. He looked amused. He amused himself by picturing her in one of Cersei's silken gowns in place of one of her studded leather jerkins. As well dressed a cow in silk as this one. Obsession over Cersei, unexpected and surprising poetic musings, and misogyny. There's classic Jaime material that we start A Storm of Swords off with. Jaime thinks that Brienne could grow good with those muscled legs and arms, but she never grew tired throughout the night. By the way, he's so not into her already. Brienne spoke like a highborn and wore a long sword and dagger. But can she handle a sword well? Jaime was going to find out, which of course has absolutely no subtext at all. As for Jaime, he was in handcuffs and foot cuffs joined together with a chain because that's his kink, maybe. And we do not kink shame on the Nauticast podcast. Jaime thinks back to his escape from River Run. He was very drunk from Catelyn's wine, and he could only recall some of what happened. Brienne had gotten him out of his cell and overcome a jailer. He leaned on Brienne to get up the endless stairs, got into a traveler's coat, and got put into a skiff. Catelyn orders the portcullis of the Watergate raised, and then they were off. Jaime took a nap during the entire ordeal. But now Jaime was awake, thinking that Tyrion is going to laugh himself silly through the events of his escape. Jaime asked if Brienne would like to take his irons off so he could row. No, he will stay in his chains. He figured to row all the way to King's Landing, wench. You will call me Brienne, not wench. My name is Sir Jaime, not Kingslayer. Do you deny that you slew a king? No. Do you deny your sex? If so, unlace those breeches and show me. He gave her an innocent smile. I'd ask you to open your bodice, but from the look of you, that wouldn't prove much. Sir Cleo sprayed, cousin, remember your courtesies. Nagging Brienne complete, Jaime spares a stray thought about cousin Cleos. He was Aunt Jenna Lannister's son by Aemon Frey. Aemon was scared shitless of Tywin and sided with Tywin when Walder Frey raised his banners for River Run and Robb Stark. Cleos looks like a weasel, is kind of a bad fighter, and is also a coward. Cleos joined in on this thing because Catelyn vowed to release him if he helped deliver Jaime to Tyrion. They'd all done a deal of vowing back in that cell, Jaime most of all. That was Lady Catelyn's price for loosing him. She had laid the point of the big wench's sword against his heart and said, swear to me that you will never take up arms against Stark nor Tully. Swear that you will compel your brother to honor his pledge to return my daughter safe and unharmed. Swear on your honor as a knight, on your honor as a Lannister, on your honor as a sworn brother of the King's Guard. Swear it by your sister's life and your father's and your son's, by the old gods and the new, and I'll send you back to your sister. Refuse, and I will have your blood. He remembered the prick of the steel through his rags as she twisted the point of the sword. Jaime thinks that the High Septon would probably look askance at a vow done by sword point, and also while he's drunk, which Jaime doesn't care, of course. He is kind of mystified at why Catelyn was trusting someone she did not actually trust, but then he realizes that Catelyn was trusting Tyrion, not him. He thinks aloud that Catelyn isn't stupid. Brienne thinks she's talking about him, but Jaime replies that he wasn't. He was just talking to himself. Jaime decides to talk with Brienne then, noting that Brienne is nobly born. She is. She was the daughter of Selwyn Tarth, Lord of Evenfall. Jaime politely notes that Tarth is a ghastly rock, but why is Brienne supporting Robb Stark instead of Stannis? Well, Brienne serves Catelyn, but seriously, shut the fuck up, Jaime, or talk to Cleos. Brienne doesn't care to hear from monsters. Jaime, oh, are there monsters here about? Hiding beneath the water, perhaps? In that thick of willows? And me, without my sword? A man who would violate his own sister, murder his king, and flee an innocent child to his death deserves no other name. Innocent? The wretched boy was spying on us. All Jaime had wanted was an hour alone with Cersei. Their journey north had been one long torment, seeing her every day, unable to touch her, knowing that Robert stumbled drunkenly into her bed every night in that great creaking wheelhouse. Tyrion had done his best to keep him in good humor, but it had not been enough. Jaime warns Brienne to be courteous when it comes to Cersei. He says this while calling her a wench for only like the 5th or 6th time in this chapter, though. Brienne states that her name is Brienne, but Jaime wonders why she should care what a monster calls her. Instead of answering, Brienne just repeats that her name is Brienne for the 2nd or 3rd time. Lady Brienne? She looked so uncomfortable that Jaime sensed a weakness. Or would Sir Brienne be more to your taste? He laughed. No, I fear not. You could trick out a milk cow in copper and crupper, crinnet, and camphron, and barter her all in silk, but that doesn't mean you can ride her into battle. Cleos quivers that Jaime should be nice and they shouldn't fight, but Jaime says he only quarrels with swords, not with words. Anyways, Jaime wants to know if every woman on Tarth is as ugly as Brienne is, which, Jesus, dude. In response, Brienne says that the Sapphire Island is beautiful, but please, for God's sake, Jaime, shut the fuck up, or else she's going to gag Jaime. She's rude as well, isn't she, cuz? Jaime asked Sir Cleos. Though she has steel in her spine, I'll grant you. Not many men dare call me monster to my face. Though behind my back they speak it freely enough, I have no doubt. Sir Cleos coughed nervously. Lady Brienne has those lies from Catelyn Stark, no doubt. The Starks cannot hope to defeat you with words, sir. So now they make words with poison words. They did defeat me with swords, you chinless cretin. Jaime smiled knowingly. Men will read all sorts of things into a knowing smile if you let them. Has Cousin Cleo truly swallowed this kettle of dung, or is he striving to ingratiate himself? What do we have here? An honest muttonhead or a lickspittle? Cleos continues on by saying that Jaime is very obviously innocent at the attempted murder of Bran because he's a Kingsguard, and the Kingsguard, as everyone knows in all of Westeros history, have never harmed children, not once ever. Jaime decides that Cleos is, in that case, a lickspittle, but he had regretted pushing Bran from the window. No, not the moral side of it, because, who gives a shit about that? Just because Cersei wouldn't shut up about it. Cersei's plan was to frighten the boy into silence. As Cersei warned that Bran may talk when he woke up, Jaime pulled Cersei onto his lap and said they declared Bran a liar and then killed Ned Stark if it came to the worst. And what do you imagine Robert will do? Cersei asked. Let Robert do as he pleases. I'll go to war with him if I must. The war for Cersei's cunt, the singers will call it. Jaime, let me go, she raged, struggling to rise. Instead, he had kissed her. For a moment, she resisted, but then her mouth opened under his. He remembered the taste of wine and cloves on her tongue. She gave a shudder. His hand went to her bottom, spilled free, and for a time, the Stark boy had been forgotten. Jaime wonders if Cersei had hired the catspaw that Catelyn had mentioned back in A Clash of Kings, but he doesn't think so because Cersei would have sent Jaime to do her child murdering for her. Back to the river, the sun was rising as the skiff passes red clay on the south bank and high rocky bluffs on the north bank. When the wind shifts, Cleos helps Brienne get the sail up. As Brienne takes the rudder, Jaime says they'd go faster if they went to Harrenhal to Tywin instead of to Tyrion. But Sansa and Arya are in King's Landing, according to Brienne, so they're going there. At that, Jaime asks Cleos for his knife, but Brienne refuses, saying that Jaime is not to be armed. Okay, fine. Jaime will have Cleos shave him bald. Why? Because everyone knows that Jaime is a beardless knight with long golden hair. He'll have a yellow beard and no hair, instead to move unawares towards King's Landing. And so Cleo shaves Jaime with a somewhat dull knife, and Jaime's hair falls into the river. Some of his beard was trimmed short as well. Jaime takes a look into the water to see the visage appearing back at him. The reflection in the water was a man he did not know. Not only was he bald, but he looked as though he had aged 5 years in that dungeon. His face was thinner with hollows under his eyes and lines he did not remember. I don't look as much like Cersei this way. She'll hate that. By noon, Cleos is asleep, and Jaime is stretching out to watch the world go by, loving the sights and sounds of the world that was totally not a dungeon. They see some houses on poles and a river, but no people. Jaime catches a sight of silvery trout and thinks that's a really bad sign, but they keep pressing forward. And then he sees a worse omen. Dead people floating in the water wearing Lannister crimson cloaks. That seemed like a really bad fucking sign. As they move, Jaime thinks the Forks of the Trident would have been a lot more busy with lots of folks going up or down the river selling stuff, but the war had altered that significantly. Deserted villages, empty nets, and when they did meet people, they fled or watched them warily until they passed. In terms of terrain, the Red Fork was more dangerous than met the eye, flowing slowly but full of sandbars and snags, but Brienne maneuvered around them. Jaime tries to compliment Brienne on her handling of the skiff, but Brienne says she doesn't know this river, only the waters around Tarth. Cleos, the Pooh Frey, wakes up then and says, "Tut, tut, smells like rain." Jaime thinks rain would have been great as he stinks real bad from being in the dungeons. But then Cleos sees smoke down the river. As they approach, Jaime sees a smoldering building and an oak tree with dead women hanging from the branches. The crows had scarcely started on their corpses. The thin ropes cut deeply into the soft flesh of their throats, and when the wind blew, they twisted and swayed. "This was not chivalrously done," said Brienne when they were close enough to see it clearly. "No true knight would condone such wanton butchery." "True knights see worse every day they ride to war, wench," said Jaime, "and do worse, yes." Brienne turned the rudder towards the shore. "I'll leave no innocents to be food for crows." "A heartless wench. Crows need to eat as well. Stay to the river and leave the dead alone, woman." Instead, Brienne lands upstream of the oak and they get out. Jaime dunks his head in the water and laughs at his less muddy reflection. He looks thinner and paler than he remembered. Brienne orders the corpses cut down from the tree, and Jaime offers himself. He just needed these chains off, Brienne, though. But he just needed these chains off. Brienne, though, doesn't hear him. The wench was staring up at one of the dead women. Jaime shuffled closer with small stutter steps, the only kind the foot-long chain permitted. When he saw the crude sign hung around the neck of the highest corpse, he smiled. They lay with lions, he read. Oh, yes, woman, this was most unchivalrously done. But by your side, not mine. I wonder who they were, these women. Cleo says they're tavern wenches that he and the men may have kind of sort of hung out with. They fucked the sex workers, if you know what I mean, is what he's basically saying. Jaime didn't know about sex work. That was all of Tyrion's business. He was only into virtuously forking his sister like a gentleman. Jaime thinks that this is Brackenland, and that's why Lord Jonas ordered them killed. Or maybe it was Mark Piper, which maybe, I guess, or Barrick Dondarrion, which absolutely not, or Roose Bolton. Yeah, I can see that happening. Jaime thinks Bolton unlikely as Tywin would beat him at the Green Fork. Yeah, but Roose kind of came back and took Harrenhal. Anybody tell you about that, Jaime? Jaime liked the sound of that, not at all. Brienne, he said, granting her the courtesy of the name and hope that she might listen. So noble, Jaime. If Lord Bolton holds Harrenhal, both the Trident and the King's Road are likely watched. He thought he saw a touch of uncertainty in her big blue eyes. You are under my protection. They need to kill me. I shouldn't think that would trouble them much. I am as good a fighter as you, she said defensively. I was one of King Renly's chosen 7. With his own hand, he cloaked me with the striped silk of the Rainbow Guard. The Rainbow Guard. You and 6 other girls, was it? A Sigurd once said that all maids are fair in silk. But he never met you, did he? The woman turned red. We have graves to dig. She went to climb the tree. Brienne cuts down the corpses as Cleo complains about caring for the bodies of the dead sex workers. But then Brienne shouts that they need to get back into the boat. She sees a sail. It takes them a minute to get into the boat, but when they do, Brienne orders Cleo to grab an oar. They move quickly through the water. Jaime sees the top of the other sail, commenting that it's mud red and watery blue in color. Brienne orders Cleo to row faster. The inn disappears behind them, and Jaime hopes the noble Tully stop to bury the dead girls. Jaime does not want to go back to the dungeon. Tyrion would think this is something clever to do here, but Jaime can only think to go at them with the sword. For the good part of an hour, they played peek and seek with the pursuers, sweeping around the bends and between small wooded isles. Just when they were starting to hope that somehow they might have left behind the pursuit, the distant sail became visible again. Sir Cleos paused in his stroke. The others, take them! He wiped sweat from his brow. Row, Brienne said. That's a river galley coming after us, Jaime announced after he'd watched for a while. With every stroke, it seemed to grow a little larger. 9 oars on each side, which means 18 men. More if they crowded on fighters as well as rowers, and larger sails than ours. We cannot outrun her. Sir Cleo squeaks that it's 18 dudes, but Jaime thinks he'll take on 6 Tullys at a time, though he'd prefer 8 if he was unchained. P.S. Brienne, can you and Jaime please? No? Okay, fine. But Jaime notes that they're going to catch up as they have more rowers and probably have more like 20 to 25 people on that ship. His cousin groaned, we can't hope to defeat 18. Did I say we could? The best we can hope for is to die with swords in our hands. He was perfectly sincere. Jaime Lannister had never been afraid of death. Brienne stops rowing for a moment and growls that Jaime is under her protection. Jaime thinks that seems rather Sandra Clegane-like if he had tits, of course, but she also has no tits. So look, I'm just the messenger here conveying what is in this chapter, folks. All this misogyny is not coming from the internal mind and heart of myself. The river galley catches up with the skiff pretty quickly as Tully bros come up on deck. Jaime notes the archers, and he hates archers. Then he sees the River Run captain of guards, Sir Robin Ryger, who emerges on deck. When the boats are only 50 yards apart, Jaime yells across the water, asking if Sir Robin had come to wish Jaime Godspeed. No. Come to take you back, Kingslayer, Sir Robin Ryger bellowed. How is it that you have lost your golden hair? I hope to blind my enemies with the sheen off my head. It worked well enough for you. Sir Robin was unamused. The distance between skiff and galley had shrunk to 40 yards. Throw your oars and your weapons into the river, and no one need be harmed. Cleos tells Jaime to tell Robin that Catelyn sent them, and Jaime does so, but it doesn't do any good, as Robin declares that Catelyn is not the one actually in charge of River Run. As Robin says this, 4 archers join Robin up on the deck. He orders Jaime to throw his sword into the river. In response, Jaime says, look, bro, I don't have a sword, but he'd be happy to kill the shit out of Robin if he did. In response, 4 arrows come from the telly ship as Brienne angles the skiff across a bend in the Red Fork. The sail cracks as Brienne shifts the tiller, the sail rippling. Jaime watched her eyes. Pretty eyes, he thought, and calm. He knew how to read a man's eyes. He knew what fear looked like. She is determined, not desperate. 30 yards behind, the galley was entering the bend. Sir Cleos, take the tiller, the wench commanded. Kingslayer, take an oar and keep us off the rocks. As my lady commands. An oar was not a sword, but a blade could break a man's face if well swung, and the shaft could be used to parry. Oh, Brienne has pretty eyes, Jaime. Weird that you're noticing little things like that. So weird. Cleo shoves an oar at Jaime and scrambles to the tiller and turns hard away from the bluff. They move from sunlight to shadow, but then the boat rocks, and Jaime feels the skiff rocking and hears a splash in the water. He turns to see Brienne scrambling up a bluff and then climbing up that sheer rock face. Jaime thinks this foolish as he orders Cleos to keep steering as Robin Riker's ship turns towards them from the bend. The sharp turns are making it hard for the archers, but Jaime knows they'll adjust sooner or later. Jaime sees Brienne is halfway up the cliff face, and he decides to distract her and buy her time. Jaime decided to see if the old man's pride would make him stupid. Sir Robin, he shouted, hear me for a moment. Sir Robin raised a hand and his archers lowered their bows. Say what you will, Kingslayer, but say it quickly. The skiff swung through a litter of broken stones as Jaime called out, I know a better way to settle this. Single combat, you and I. I was not born this morning, Lannister. No, but you're like to die this afternoon. Jaime raised his hand so the other could see the manacles. I'll fight you in chains. What could you fear? But Robin has his orders, and his orders are to bring Jaime back to River Run. He orders his bowmen into action, but then a series of pebbles starts falling all around them. And then a huge boulder detaches from the cliff and comes crashing down the bluff, splitting in two, with one chunk snapping the mast and the other drilling a hole into the hull. Jaime watches as men start abandoning ship, realizing that some of them couldn't swim in laps because Jaime is on a redemption path. Jaime and Cleos leave the archers behind, and Jaime thinks he'd be rid of Brienne and would get out of chains, but then Cleos shouts. Jaime looks up and sees Brienne moving across the cliff top. She jumps off the rock and forms into a graceful dive. When she hits the water, Cleos angles the skiff towards Jaime, still clutching his oar, thinking that he can hit her and be free of her. Instead, Jaime found himself stretching the oar out over the water. Brienne grabbed hold and Jaime pulled her in. As he helped her into the skiff, water ran from her hair and dripped from her sodden clothing to the pool on the deck. She's even uglier wet. Who could have thought it possible? You're a bloody, stupid wench, Jaime told her. We could have sailed on without you. I suppose you expect me to thank you. I want none of your thanks, Kingslayer. I swore an oath to bring you safe to King's Landing. And you actually mean to keep it? Jaime gave her his brightest smile. Now there's a wonder. And that is the synopsis for A Storm of Swords. Jaime won. I have many thoughts. If you couldn't tell already, about Jaime's first chapter, about Jaime Lannister, the person, Jaime Lannister, the idea, Jaime Lannister, the book that A Storm of Swords is totally about. I'm kidding. But we'll get to all of that throughout A Storm of Swords. I am just loving the fact, though, that we are actually here covering a Jaime chapter. And I love that we're doing it with two special people. What did you both think of this chapter?
Well, I guess you were right what you said earlier, Jeff. Jaime is objectively the best POV in A Song of Ice and Fire. No, I never quite fell in love with Jaime the way a lot of people do. And maybe that'll change as we go through A Storm of Swords and I see him through your eyes. But even if not, it doesn't really matter because his chapters are so well written that I love them anyway. And this chapter is a perfect beginning. George covers all his bases without tipping his hand as to where he's taking this character. It starts with a lighter tone than most Jaime chapters, gets very dark in the middle, and wraps up with a thrilling action sequence designed to make you keep reading, like the cliffhanger in the prologue. Already in Storm of Swords, we're seeing this assured confidence in George's writing as the story comes to him faster than ever. It feels like there's nothing he can't do. What did you think of this chapter, Shiloh?
I remember on my first read of these books hitting the Jaime chapters and literally saying out loud, God damn it, George, stop making me like this guy. It's been interesting being on my now 7th-ish reread, how much my views on characters in general have changed and how these chapters don't really make me like him more anymore. He is a very layered character and there's more to tease out kind of every time I go through it because George writes him very, very well.
That's well said. I think, my first thought when I opened up, when I turned the page from the Storm of Swords prologue, or in reality heard Roy Dotrice finish the prologue and transition to Jaime, was an audible, oh, Jaime. I hated Jaime in the first two books. Why would George inflict his point of view on us readers? That's what I was thinking anyways. Don't think that anymore, as you could probably tell, because what George does with Jaime is reintroduce him to us as readers. It's kind of a soft retcon of the character we at least knew in the Game of Thrones, because as we've talked about before, Jaime wasn't planned as a point of view character. Per the pitch letter, Jaime was originally envisioned as a just straight up fucking villain killing his way to the Iron Throne. And that is the version of Jaime from book 1 of Game of Thrones. But by the final Catelyn, A Clash of Kings chapter, and really especially here, George kind of reboots Jaime. I love the way that George kind of symbolizes this through Jaime shaving off those beautiful curls on the river and then dunking his head into the river. Please tell me that isn't George baptizing Jaime to readers' eyes, visualizing how we're supposed to reevaluate Jaime from the original impression we had of the man. And soon, that very hand, the one that pushed Bran from the window, will be gone too. What George was kind of asking us is, do you recognize the man in front of you? Will he be the same man at the end of the story? And that has that dynamic integrated into the first Jaime chapter into A Storm of Swords. Makes it an exciting start of our journey with Jaime Lannister together with you all.
It's a very interesting chapter in terms of transition, in terms of transitioning us away from what we used to see Jaime in terms of a really new character. And I want to start with the transition into this chapter from the prologue. George is great at sequencing, one chapter playing off the next in interesting ways. He makes use of the gap, like the silence in between songs on an album, or the gutters, the space in between comic panels. Chet's prologue ended on a nightmarish cliffhanger. The arrival of ice demons and their zombie army, ready to wreck shit, and then boom, we're drifting downriver in the pale pink dawn, a breeze tugging at Jaime like a lover's fingers. Everything has changed. The setting, the imagery, the tone, it all feels like the opposite of the previous chapter. We were sucked into hell, and now we've been spat back out into something resembling paradise. It's like a palate cleanser, washing away the taste of Chet's POV, recalibrating our senses so we can get used to Jaime's headspace. As I said last week, when that third horn blast sounded north of the wall, it felt like nothing else in the world mattered anymore, like everything was about to change. Yet, now here we are, with the river running eternally, the birds chirping like nothing's wrong. As your namesake, Jeff, said on the Throne Show, it often comforts me to think that even in the war's darkest days, in most places in the world, absolutely nothing is happening. The danger for Jaime is all too human, the war and the emptiness inside him. Even if the others never returned, he'd have to face them. The jarring shift in tone is appropriate for his character. Not only does the book kind of feel like it's been reborn, but Jaime feels that way too. He's emerged from the dark cave beneath Riverrun, a womb, a crucible for his rebirth. He's getting used to the world again, and we have to reacquaint ourselves with Westeros through a new pair of eyes.
I think that's perfectly said. It's a new set of eyes, and it's kind of being a palate cleanser from the prologue is an exactly correct way to approach this chapter. In terms of genre, George loves to do these kind of like switches in the narrative, because we went from the brutal, evil character study of Chet, which transitions to horror at chapter's end. And then here in Jaime's chapter, it's all the beautiful scenery, and then an almost swashbuckling adventure story by the end of the chapter. It could have felt like Whiplash, but somehow it doesn't to me. And I think one of the main reasons why is the character of Jaime himself. Because part of what makes Jaime so dynamic to me is how he starts at the level that readers expect him to be at. He's a mockery of chivalry. Wait, Shiloh, don't get mad at me. Stay with me. I promise. I will bring it home at the end. Jaime's got the looks, right? The skills to thrill, and a society that makes him the model chivalric knight, right? Well, no. Jaime also has that less than stellar personality that goes along with that. The one where he's constantly insulting Brienne, unchivalrously as cousin Cleo's chides Jaime, or like a fucking misogynistic jerk, as we find out throughout this chapter.
I'm 100% with you on this one, buddy. In fact, if people have about 3-ish hours to kill, the latest Learn Hands episode covers the whole question of chivalry and how Jaime ain't it pretty well, if I say so.
It's really good that you... No, it's awesome, and I think it's really good that you're coming from that episode, because that was such a good episode. I love that episode. In fact, I'm going to listen to it again one of these days. And I think like what you're saying and what I was saying is kind of a major component of why Jaime works here immediately after the prologue, because we've seen Chet's red boils, his ugliness, felt his rage, and seen his alienation from everyone around him north of the wall. And then when we get to Jaime, he's got, like I said, the skills, the looks, but he's as embittered as Chet. Now, the main difference for Jaime, though, is that his embitterment over chivalry is not like that kind of like got stomped down his entire life. His main embitterment comes from the cynical sort, kind of the optimist who believed in something fiercely once, who is bitterly disappointed by it. Again, I am offended by any potential correlations to my own life experiences, and I'm shocked, Emmett, that you would even suggest and think this.
Why do I keep accusing you of that? I don't know what's wrong with me. Everyone stop and leave Jeff alone immediately. So after we've recovered from the shock of how the prologue ended, and the shock of Jaime being our POV now, next up is the shock of what's actually happening in this chapter. Why are Jaime and company in a boat on a river? When last we saw these characters, Catelyn was calling for Brienne's sword. We might think Catelyn's about to execute Jaime on the spot. But George set up Catelyn's desperate desire to get her daughters back, especially after she hears that Theon killed Bran and Rickon. Cleos told her about Tyrion's public promise to exchange her daughters for Jaime. Gradually, we realize that Catelyn is trying to make that deal. She has sprung Jaime from jail and sent him on his way to King's Landing. That is kind of a big deal, as we'll see starting next week in Catelyn 1. Here, though, Jaime doesn't dwell on the politics of his release. He's alienated from the power structures of Westeros, even those that he's a part of, as we'll see throughout the rest of the book. So he's not thinking, this is good for the Lannisters and bad for the Starks. That's not really what he cares about. I mean, to be fair, he's just recovering from months in a cell, not to mention getting drunk off his ass at the end there. So everything for him is sensory. He only remembers bits and pieces. Brienne knocking out the guard, Catelyn giving all the orders. When Jaime tried to escape previously, it was with a sword in hand. This time, he slept right through it. And this sets up the dynamic between freedom and control running through Jaime's chapters. He was dragged out of his cell rather than escaping, and even now, he wears chains. So has he truly been set free?
He spends a lot of the book as a passive or passive-ish character, being kind of handed off from one captor to another, offers being made to trade him, almost like he's in the damsel position of his own story, and Brienne's his knightly protector. He tries to claim the active protector role a couple of times, but it doesn't work out so well for him.
There's that pointed example of when he tries to draw a sword after his hand is cut off and tries to get away, and it's just a hopeless failure, and all the mummers are laughing at him. He's wearing literal chains, but also metaphorical ones. He's imprisoned by the past, his devotion to Cersei, and of course his reputation, the eye of the beholder. Ultimately, he has imprisoned himself. As Jeff said, Jaime is a cynical man. He has learned not to invest himself emotionally. We see that in how he thinks about the oath he swore Catelyn. He doesn't consider it binding, remembering only the steel of the sword as Catelyn pressed it against him. That's all that really matters. Looks like the hostage trade might be in trouble. Then again, as Jaime thinks, Catelyn is trusting him as little as she dares, putting her faith in Tyrion instead. Who would trust me? I have shit for honor. I broke my oaths. As it turns out, this internal drama is the whole point of Jaime's story in this book. Actually getting him to King's Landing is an anticlimax. By the time they arrive, their mission is moot. Sansa's gone, and Catelyn's dead. So the stakes become more personal, even existentialist. It's about who Jaime is by the end of the journey, compared to how he starts here.
And I think this is one reason that even though I go back and forth on whether or not he's actually on a redemption arc and whether I even like him that much, he's still fascinating to me because he does have such a clear arc, whether it's a redemption arc or not. And it's going to be super interesting to see what George ultimately does with him in the Winds of Winter when we get it next week.
And I go back and forth on that kind of thing too. And I'm starting to think maybe it's less about whether we like Jaime or society likes Jaime, and more about whether just Jaime likes Jaime. Because Jaime doesn't like Jaime very much. You know, he makes that joke that, you'd think my word as a Lannister was not good enough. But that's really how he feels. Jaime doesn't believe in oaths anymore. He doesn't believe in the High Septon, he thinks, nor the gods he claims to serve, nor anything really beyond Cersei. We started to learn why in Clash of Kings, with his story about the Mad King murdering the Starks in front of him. But as Jaime admitted, that still doesn't explain how he became the man he is. And what I love about how George writes Jaime is how he reflects his compartmentalization. So much is buried in the subtext because so much is buried in Jaime's subconscious. George hides his depths from the audience at first to reflect how Jaime is hiding from himself. His true feelings are connected to secrets he cannot let slip, secrets about both Aerys and Cersei. He thinks of himself as an island because that denies any vulnerability. When his hand is cut off, he can't deny vulnerability any longer.
Absolutely. And though the endpoint is moot by the time Jaime reaches King's Landing in Storm of Swords, there is something we learn in later chapters, which is that Jaime intends to keep his oath. Not because he's some sort of oath keeper, but because it'd be real fucking funny if he kept his oath, right, guys? Jaime had decided he would return Sansa and the younger girl as well if she could be found. It was not like to win him back his lost honor, but the notion of keeping faith when they all expected betrayal amused him more than he could say. But even in that later Jaime chapter, Jaime's inner thought process masks what's really at work in Jaime's chapters. Because Jaime uses his bitter, cutting sarcasm and cynicism as internal and external shields to a world that doesn't really make sense to him.
Which is interesting because Tyrion does the same thing, but because the world makes too much sense to him.
Right. It's so logical for Tyrion that the world is the way that it is to him because that's what he grew up as experience. And Jaime is like, this doesn't make sense to me. It's just, I just have to put up these shields and these barriers against the world outside. Because when Jaime was young and idealistic, he wanted to be Sir Arthur Dane, a knight in shining armor, abiding by the oaths of chivalry and knighthood and the best ideals of the King's Guard. But now that Jaime has been bitterly disappointed by reality not meeting his expectations, his defense mechanism is to pose as the shittiest person you'd ever meet. Again, stop making comparisons to me. But as you were saying, the journey is more important than the destination for Jaime's character. And the journey is all about stripping away that veneer to get to the bathhouse where all defenses are stripped away to reveal the raw truth in person beneath that veneer. For me, it's an utterly thrilling story, but this one central dynamic of the story is oaths, what they mean and what value we put into them. But George wouldn't be as interested in this dynamic unless there was a dramatic foil to cut away the veneer, a person who Jaime absolutely does not like one bit, never love, not love, but those eyes, God, those eyes are so beautiful. I mean, she's so ugly, but those eyes.
Those dreamy blue eyes. Yeah, what everyone loves in Jaime's chapters, no matter how you feel about him, is his relationship with Brienne. It's some of George's best character work. And what makes it such an engaging dynamic is that it's both obvious and subtle. The deeper currents of connection are as profound as they are because of how immediately and hilariously they butt heads here. Long before they change each other's lives, they just piss each other off. Jaime and Brienne are a couple right out of screwball comedy. Screwball comedies were popular in the Great Depression era and have been influential ever since on modern romantic comedies. They spoofed romantic plots by emphasizing fast-paced conversation and farcical situations. The romance emerged gradually out of that humor rather than being an earnest seduction from the start. There's often a class element in screwball comedies, with the rich presented as idle and leisurely. Brienne is highborn, of course, but Jaime mistakes her for a big, strong peasant woman at first, so that dynamic is in there. You've got your roguish male lead, a fail son of immense privilege. You've got your no-nonsense female lead just trying to do her job. They're the perfect odd couple. Jaime's smiling, Brienne is scowling. She's rowing hard, he's lying back and looking at the trees. Made for each other. They bounce off each other, talk past each other, do everything they can to avoid vulnerability with each other. Yet in the process, they fall for each other. And this is the classic screwball structure. Enemies to lovers, as they call it in the fanfic world. Here at the beginning, they're both operating strictly on the surface with each other. Jaime mocks Brienne for not living up to beauty standards, for not looking how he thinks a woman ought to look. More specifically, she doesn't look like Cersei, the only woman Jaime's ever had sex with, his gold standard for all women. Jaime pictures Brienne in one of Cersei's silk gowns, thinking it would be like dressing up a cow. These vicious insults are the face Jaime shows not only the world, but himself. Under the surface, something else is going on. Why does Jaime picture Brienne in the dress at all? Why does he take note of not only her calf muscles like cords of wood, but also her pretty blue eyes? Because no matter what he says or consciously thinks, he's attracted to her. As Shiloh said, at some level, Jaime is the damsel in distress, and Brienne is the knight whose strong biceps he clings to while he flutters his eyelashes. That also fits with screwball comedies, in which characters often cross-dress or impersonate each other, wearing a variety of masks. Jaime starts off the book with strict gender roles in mind, calling Brienne my lady and then wench. We are different, men and women, and you're lesser. But over the course of the book, he comes to realize that this distinction is, largely at least, a social construct, one that has made them both miserable. And so he will decide to try and be less miserable, get outside the things he's taken for granted, and make something new, something better. That goes hand in hand with opening up to Brienne. Here, though, he cannot deal with his subconscious attraction to her, the anti-Cersei, so he externalizes it as mockery. No way I could be attracted to a freak like you.
Right. And I mean, like, there is a twisted version of chivalry inherent in Jaime's fixation on Cersei throughout this chapter and his successive chapters, and the internally stated disregard for Brienne. Jaime notes later that he left sex workers for Tyrion because Cersei was all he needed. That mental thought invokes the thought of kind of monogamous, chivalrous love, doesn't it? Albeit one which is quite twisted from its recognized form. Jaime almost thinks about Cersei like a wife, a bride, the one and only that he has sworn to be with.
Almost like Lancelot and Guinevere.
That's a great comparison. And in Jaime's memory, he was willing to go to war with Ned Stark or Robert Baratheon over his sister, which invokes really all sorts of weird chivalrous feelings when it comes to Jaime's feelings. What I wonder with all of these Brienne is so ugly statements and thoughts is Jaime putting up barriers so as not to be tempted towards cheating on Cersei. It's almost like he's overcompensating with the insults to shield his heart from being stolen away by this blue-eyed hottie. Of course, his fidelity to Cersei is twisted by, the incest part of it, but it wouldn't be Jaime without his expression of chivalry to be tied up with something not quite right. For her part, though, Cersei is not going to have that same fidelity to Jaime that he has for her, but I'll save some of those thoughts towards the end of this chat that we're going to have tonight. Later in this book, Jaime will pose the question of why can we be Targaryens to Cersei, which Cersei will dismiss due to Tywin, who, did marry his cousin after all. But I think that all begs the question. So I've talked so much about Cersei. What does Brienne think about Jaime? What about Brienne?
Yeah, Brienne, for her part, resents Jaime even more than he resents her. Their relationship begins with Brienne telling Jaime to shut the fuck up. Quit laughing at the world. Quit enjoying yourself. Brienne has no interest in his rebirth. Jaime may think scowls suit Brienne more than smiles, but we saw a smile light up her face when Renly made her one of his Rainbow Guard. We saw her naive belief in the stories and songs. We saw her grief for Renly. We saw her sorrowful solitude in Riverrun. This hostility is new, and it's inspired by Jaime. Here's the twist on the screwball formula. The male lead isn't just roguish. He's not like Cary Grant wandering the country or something. He's a child-killing, sister-fucking oathbreaker. And the initial distaste between the couple is philosophical as much as it is personal. Brienne loathes Jaime for his crimes. She wants him in chains, metaphorical societal chains as well as literal ones. She doesn't even think of him as a person, not really. Instead, as she says, she thinks of him as a monster, the Kingslayer. It's only when she calls him that he shifts from calling her my lady to wench. Jaime is so used to being dehumanized that he dehumanizes everyone else. He's pure alienation. Like Chet, he learned only how to hit back. Brienne tells him to call him by her true name. And that's all he wants to be seen as a person again. Even a bad person, Jaime, instead of the Kingslayer. Well, why shouldn't she call him the Kingslayer, she asks. Didn't he kill a king? Isn't that accurate? Well, sure, he says, but she's a woman and still doesn't like being called wench. Moreover, if he's such a monster, what does she care? My word only hurt because they're coming from another human being, like you. Jaime is expressing deep pain in the most crude and juvenile way possible. If you call me names, well, I'll call you names. Jaime senses that Brienne's weak spot is her gender presentation. She wants to be a knight, but isn't allowed to. He zeroes in on that to distract from his own weak spots. And in between them is Cleos Frey, the hapless third leg of the triangle. The Jaime-Brienne dynamic exposes the holes in social norms, how they fail to match up with individuals. Cleos tries to uphold those norms, and fails over and over again.
And because we never get into Cleos's head, George leaves us to wonder just how much of it does he actually mean? Is he just upset that Jaime isn't following the chivalric script? Or, as Jaime himself wonders, does he really believe all of it, including the demonstrably untrue parts?
Right. It's an interesting little moment where he's wondering, Cleos, are you aware of your own bullshit and you're just playing along? Or are you so deep you don't even realize a lie when it's coming out of your mouth? And that's just, Jamie's just been kind of so embittered after years of that kind of conversation.
Mhm.
Even as Jamie insults Brienne for challenging him, part of him finds her honesty refreshing. Most people only call me a monster behind my back. That's because most people Jamie knows are like Cleos, polite to his face, which only makes him hate them more. They're hypocrites, they're ignorant lickspittles, as he thinks. Cleos defends Jamie from Brienne's accusations. The Starks could never defeat such a great warrior with swords, so they do it with lies. But, as Jamie thinks, the Starks did defeat him with swords. Why do you think I've been in jail for the whole last book? And he did indeed throw Bran from the window. He prefers Brienne's truth, even though she hates him, to Cleos's lies, even though Cleos is kissing up to him. Jamie keeps those thoughts to himself, of course. He gives a knowing smile, letting Cleos read whatever he wants into it. That's how Jamie operates. The only person with whom he has ever been intimate is Cersei. Their power dynamic is complicated. We'll see that in King's Landing, and we see it in this little flashback here. Jamie kicks things off physically, and is blunt and aggressive in terms of how he talks about Cersei's body. But Cersei really seems like the one in charge. Jamie only threw Bran because he thought she'd want him to, and regrets it afterward when she complains. He'd go to war against Robert and Ned and anyone else just to be with her. He would have killed Bran in his bed for her if she told him to. She knows that, and has made use of it. Once again, George is turning romantic tropes on their head. Robert fought a rebellion for his lost love. Look how that turned out. Same applies to Jamie. His all-consuming chivalric romance is with his own twin sister, a narcissistic hive mind that has led to murder and war. As he thinks when he spilled open Cersei's bodice, the Stark boy was forgotten. Sex with his mirror image keeps the bad thoughts at bay. Whereas Brienne's bodice doesn't distract him. She makes him think consciously about all of it, and he hates that. So Brienne and Cersei are the two poles of Jamie's arc. Which one will he be with? More importantly, which one will he be like? Jamie asks for a knife. Brienne thinks he's trying to escape, but he wants only to turn the blade on himself, cutting away his golden Lannister locks. He doesn't want to be recognized in this state. This isn't how he thinks of himself. This isn't the man Cersei loves, and who am I but the man Cersei loves? But cutting his hair only further separates him from her, from his whole Lannister identity. A louse scuttles out of the hair, and Jamie crushes it. The past is dead, and the man looking back at him from the river doesn't look much like Cersei anymore. He does not know who he is now.
That's a fantastic point. Cersei would hate the way Jamie looks now, and she will comment as much when they actually reunite later in the Storm of Swords. And that flows well with the idea inherent in Jamie's and Cersei's relationship, that Cersei's main interest in Jamie is an expression of narcissistic self-love. But in keeping with some of my opening remarks, I think Jamie is supposed to look less like the man readers knew in the first two books, because here he appears ugly, disheveled, older, and bald. Jamie had lost the look of chivalry, the fabled Lannister beauty. He thinks that it's for his survival now, so that he won't be recognized as Jamie Lannister. But I maintain it's a signal from George about the change in reader perception about Jamie. Jamie feels like he is eschewing or has lost the trappings of his power, the physicality that he once brought. In essence, he's becoming less of a knight in shining armor in appearance. His physical change dovetails so well with his bitter cynicism about chivalry. True knights see and do worse every single time they ride to war, as we'll discuss in a moment. But I like to think that George is stripping away the shell surrounding Jamie, the stark beauty that surrounded him, to reveal the person underneath. But that is a dynamic that is going to come later in this book. For now, there are feeding crows and humanity to attend to.
So this chapter starts with some beautiful imagery that leads into some comedic dialogue, but then the tone starts to change. What makes this different from most romantic comedies is that our odd couple is traveling through an active war zone. The horror intrudes slowly, just like in the last book when it was Arya getting deeper and deeper into the hell of the Riverlands at war. Jamie takes some passing trout as a bad omen. That's the Tully sigil. But then he sees a corpse float past, wearing Lannister crimson. Suddenly, taking the fish as an omen seems so silly. Like when Illyrio makes fun of how attached Westerosi nobles are to their symbols. Oh, you all think you actually are lions or fish or whatever. The corpse is a more blunt symbol. That is unmistakably who we are. Jamie has been reborn. That could be his old self floating past, tied to his family name, his family colors. Once, Jaime was a shining young prodigy. Once, these rivers were full of life, the people of Westeros traveling, trading, entertaining each other. Now, there are villages without villagers, and everyone they do see keeps their distance. That's how Jaime's felt his entire adult life. The empty land represents Aerys's atrocities, as Jaime says in his next chapter, but it also reflects how Jaime feels inside, alienated, walled off from humanity.
It's at this point in the podcast, it's worth again re-emphasizing that the dead bodies of abandoned villagers and suspicious villagers wouldn't have been possible if not for Tywin's illegal and immoral war. I just have to bring that up every single time we're going to talk about the war in the Riverlands. Still, we can reasonably assume that this dead Lannister floating in the river was probably a casualty of Edmure Tully's heroic yet fateful defense of the forest just a brief while ago. At the start of the Storm Stories, if you open up the book, you'll see that George has a what's he called, caveat on chronology or something like that, where he notes that the early chapters from A Storm of Swords take place at the chronological end of a Clash of Kings, especially towards those chapters that are occurring on the Blackwater. So we can assume that this is a casualty from that battle, from that earlier battle, which occurs in Catelyn's earlier chapters. Jaime wonders if this is someone that he knew, and there's no hint in the text that it is, though, and I think that's perfectly fine, great even. Because in the end, this War of the Five Kings will kill tens of thousands by the sword, and hundreds of thousands through starvation and exposure when winter comes. Also, in the end, this war, no matter how justified on the Stark side, will rob people of life and make them bloated corpses, alone and nameless.
And that feeds into what they find next. A live oak full of dead women. The beauty of nature contrasted with the ugliness of human nature. These are the literal fruits of the war. An unshakable horror image designed to generate our outrage, as it does for Brienne. She's been focused on her mission. I will return with the Stark girls or not at all. But now she stops dead to care for strangers. And that's Brienne in a nutshell. Same thing happens in A Feast for Crows, with her big no chance and no choice moment. That's her stepping aside from her mission to save the Stark girl, save the princess like a knight should, to care for strangers. Jaime mocked her for being a woman dressed like a knight, but here we see that Brienne upholds the values of chivalry more than most knights. As Jaime tells her, the Tullys would never stop to bury these women, and true knights see and do worse than this in every war.
This bit does some interesting work with continuing the themes of knighthood and chivalry, but also showing us that both sides are kind of assholes, not just the one. Robb might be a better man than Tywin, but the men who follow them don't necessarily have their same attitudes and compunctions. And the small folk get caught in the middle of their fights, which we've already seen from the Arya chapters in the last book.
And George emphasizes that in how he paces the scene. First we see the corpses, and then we learn which side was responsible. So he's got us. We've already absorbed the horror and can't excuse it. Imagine the war, not from Robb's perspective, or Jaime's, or Brienne's, but from the perspective of these women. They were living their lives, kneeling to Jonas Bracken if he rode through, doing him homage as their overlord. Then the Lannisters came to town. What were these women supposed to do? Refuse them service and die on the spot for it? For all they knew, the Brackens were about to fall, and these were their new masters. Even if not, keeping the soldiers happy while they're here is the best way to stay alive, to help yourself and your loved ones. These women weren't Lannister agents. They were killed for the crime of staying alive. Same thing happened at Harrenhal. Those civilians who helped Vargo Hoat when he served the Lannisters are punished for it when he switches sides to the Starks. Whoever killed these women probably didn't think they were actually disloyal, like on a level that's important to the war. It was more about sending a message to anyone who might come along. Fuck the Lannisters. That's a message we might agree with, but it's being meted out on people who had nothing to do with the Lannisters burning out the Brackens. No wonder so many small folk prefer Barrick Dondarrion, or give up on their leaders altogether. When this is how your leaders respond to an invasion, by holding you responsible for it instead of themselves, why believe in them? There is special contempt reserved for women who use sex to stay alive. I think you can see a link to Jaime's nasty attitude towards Brienne. This is what that hatred for women outside the norm looks like when converted from words to actions, put in service of a merciless power structure that sees individuals as pawns in a zero-sum struggle. Cleos represents that conventional wisdom. This is too much trouble to take for such women, and I won't sully my sword to do so. It's a cautionary tale for Jaime, but also one for Brienne, because now she sees what her own hatred of Lannisters looks like in its worst form. If Robb's righteous crusade could lead us here, as Shiloh said, maybe Brienne's righteous loathing for the Kingslayer isn't actually the best way to look at Jaime Lannister. But beyond the metaphors, these are still people who were murdered. And Jaime stays totally detached from that reality, while Brienne engages in it. Jaime's more focused on himself, naturally, his ongoing rebirth, laughing like a child at the cold touch of the water, but sobered by the realization that he is thinner and weaker than before the dungeon, a changed man. On reread, we know why Jaime tends to detach himself from violence, the traumatic memory of killing Aerys, and also why he did it. And it's from a lifetime in battle. Remember, he doesn't name horses because it's too difficult when they die. On first read, though, we don't have any of these kind of cues for sympathy for Jaime. Really, we're just kind of waiting for him to break at this point and to snap and to act like a human being.
Right, and we sort of get there by chapter's end, but we don't totally get there until we get later into Jaime's arc in A Storm of Swords. I think one of the things that caught my attention from this part of the chapter is that Cleos recognizes the sin from when his soldiers came through on their way to River Run. And I think that shrouds these murders in an even greater horror, because what I kind of suspect is that this inn was specifically targeted because Cleos's party visited. And what was Cleos's party going to River Run after all? Ostensibly, it was a diplomatic mission to Alderaan, River Run. Of course, the Lannister goons and Cleos's party were Tyrion's creatures and did try to spring Jaime free under that diplomatic banner. But still, the Brackens or Boltons or Mallisters didn't know about that betrayal when they probably came upon this inn. They wanted to make themselves feel better by spilling innocent blood. And I think Jaime bears some responsibility here. After Gregor and Amory Lorch, it was Jaime's swords that struck the first blows into the Riverlands, smashing the Tully army near the Golden Tooth. And Cleos's men had duplicitously come to River Run with the mission to free Jaime anyways. In part, Jaime's arc in A Storm of Swords is a reflection of where past blame and responsibility truly lie, and what that responsibility projects forward in the future tense. But hey, let's not get us ahead of ourselves with all of that serious shit and talk. There's swashbuckling fun to be had.
Right? Yeah, George doesn't linger on the horror in this chapter. There is plenty of that to come for later Jaime chapters. He wants to get us there step by step. The boat chase restores the breezier tone, even as the stakes get higher. This is just the fun part of the chapter.
You could totally film this with yakety sax playing under it, and it would work. And despite Jaime thinking that Tyrion would have smart-ass quips that he doesn't, he definitely gets pretty smart-ass and funny here.
Absolutely. You can feel the soundtrack picking up, and there's just this aura of like comedic disarray, and Jaime just sitting back and detached from it all. They're outnumbered by their pursuers who have a faster boat, and the situation seems hopeless. But Jaime just jokes because he's ready to die. And this is, of course, self-loathing, really, masking his courage. Jaime's bravado is rooted in his cynical certainty that nothing in life really matters anyway, so why not die? Ironically, his envisioned last stand is right out of the stories and songs. It's the same reason he hates archers, because they rob him of a straight fight. Jaime never found anything to believe in beyond a glorious death, even as he makes fun of, kind of all the structures behind that. He was shattered by harsh realities, whereas Brienne is determined to transcend them. She has the true courage, as Jaime acknowledges beneath the insults when he calls her the Hound with Teats. He's under her protection, as she says. Once again, she's the knight, and he's the damsel. The pursuers catch up in the river galley that George describes wonderfully, like a great dragonfly buzzing over the water. Robin Ryger is in command, and Jaime taunts him. It's the only language he knows, the empty swagger of fighting men, even though Sir Robin is past his prime and Jaime's skills have gone to rust, so this is all talk. Brienne tries to speak more earnestly. Oh, this is a lawful exchange of captives. But Robin points out the inconvenient truth. Catelyn's not in charge at River Run. None of this is lawful. Jaime and Brienne are outlaws now, and so Brienne has to use all her wit and strength to save them, instead of accepting death like Jaime. But he still helps out. As Cleos gapes uselessly, Jaime realizes he has to distract Sir Robin and his men so Brienne can spring the trap. So Jaime taunts Robin again, but this time it's with a purpose. This time, it's not just empty bravado. It's a performance of bravado as a diversion. And it works. Brienne knocks down the boulder in a supreme display of badassery. That took timing and quick thinking and just intense raw strength. Jaime laughs, as he's been doing all chapter. Everything's coming up Millhouse. The gods are good after all. It's a beautiful day with no one after him anymore, and he's even gotten rid of Brienne. Or has he? She swan dives after them, suddenly graceful, nothing like he would have expected. Maybe that's part of why he lets her back into the boat. It's this perfect little moment that sums up Jaime's relationship to Brienne and his story in this book. His conscious brain is going full Kingslayer. To hell with this wench. I've been getting ready to escape all chapter, and I was never going to keep my oath. Time to get rid of her for Cersei, right? But another part of him knows he owes Brienne. And even more than that, he knows she just did something amazing, impressive, like a knight. She's everything he wants to be, so he reaches out to her, literally. She swore an oath and means to keep it. He remembers what that was like. Even as Brienne despises him and calls him the Kingslayer, she's giving him hope, stirring something inside of him he thought was gone forever. You can see a parallel to Sandor and Sansa in the previous book, a moment of devotion that inspires transformation in a broken man. The songs and stories are coming true after all. It's just not in the way young Jaime ever would have expected.
So true. I mean, I love that final thought of Jaime in this chapter. And there's wonder. Because Jaime had spent the entire chapter mocking Brienne's conception of knights and chivalry. He knows the real truth behind it, the truth that it's all lies, pretty ribbons around swords that still kill you dead. Vows that are routinely broken by knights in service to lords or their own needs and wants, and their safety, their purses, their coin. But then he's confronted by Brienne, a person who embodies all of the values that Jaime once aspired to. Brienne intends to keep her vow to bring Jaime to safety, to King's Landing. Now, Brienne could have ducked out, sought her own safety, headed back to Tarth after abandoning ship. Instead, she chose to save Jaime's life. She chose her vow to safeguard a monster over an easier path. That's a wonder to Jaime. He's only ever seen the hypocrisy inherent in the system. And now he's confronted with a true believer, someone who lives the ideals he once valued. It's a wonder to Jaime because he's facing the actualization of an ideal. And he's going to be on a long, long journey with that living ideal in Brienne. But while he extends the paddle to her now, the sword is going to come out sooner or later, which is totally not a dick metaphor.
Of course not. George is above that sort of thing. He doesn't make dick jokes in every other chapter. Of course not. Of course not. So moving on to foreshadowing and groundwork for this chapter. Cleos mentions something. Cleos has kind of more recent information than Jaime because Jaime's been in the cell. So Cleos mentions that the rumor around River Run is that Roose Bolton holds Harrenhal now. And Jaime realizes, oh, that's trouble. And that will indeed spell doom for the travelers. In Catelyn 1, we learn Edmure has told Roose about the escape. And in Jaime 3, Vargo Hoat takes Jaime and Brienne captive before dragging them to Roose at Harrenhal. So even in the midst of the fun times and character setup, George is letting you know exactly where the threat is going to come from.
Right, and then Jaime brings up, hey, let's just go to Harrenhal early on. And they're like, maybe not Harrenhal. Maybe we just keep on the course of going on. And I think that George is laying the groundwork for the eventual Harrenhal plot for Jaime and the Store of Swords, which I think is really, really good.
Mm-hmm.
George reminds us about the cat's paw, the guy who went after Bran, by having Jaime think it doesn't make sense for Cersei to send anyone other than him to kill Bran Stark. But if it wasn't Cersei, probably not going to come up again. Jaime's done with that. Moving on to the next mystery. Obviously, that gets solved later in the book, but George is dropping it here, just a little paragraph, just to keep it in the back of our minds.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the Girls Gone Canon podcast brought this up about really well in Catelyn's later chapters in the Game of Thrones, where they were talking about how, Catelyn almost gets to the point where she realizes, like, oh, I'm about to solve this thing, and then she's interrupted by another event or another person that kind of gets shoved in front of her, just trying to figure out the fosterage of Robin Arryn. So George does this a lot, where he's constantly interrupting people's trains of thought, where they're just like, hey, I'm starting to put the pieces together, and nope, I haven't put the pieces together. Got to save that reveal for later on.
Thumb on the scales.
Exactly. George also reminds us about Barrick Dondarrion. This is his first mention in the book. Cleo says that he only kills soldiers, showing us how his positive reputation has spread even among Lannister loyalists. And we're going to be spending a lot of time with Barrick's reputation before we meet him. Maybe a little much, but it's George's way of showing us how the legend has spread, even beyond the man himself.
Right. It's a process that starts in the Clash of Kings with the Bloody Mummers searching for Barrick Dondarrion, and then we get the continuance here, and then in Arya's chapter is going to meet Barrick Dondarrion's band. We're not going to meet Barrick until her 6th chapter in A Storm of Swords. It takes a long while to meet Barrick Dondarrion, but the George has a really slow burn process of building up this character to the point where we are really excited to meet him on page. And I'm excited to re-meet him again in A Storm of Swords in later chapters.
And I think on purpose, we finally get... Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. No, please.
No, I would think he probably does it on purpose, where we finally get to Barrick and it's like, this guy? This guy. He's like so kind of unassuming and beat down and beat up. And it's like, wow, okay.
And he can't die, but he does often. Jaime asked if Brienne would prefer being addressed as Sir Brienne rather than Lady Brienne. And I like to think this is foreshadowing for Jaime knighting Brienne, which is an event we saw in season 8, episode 2. And I do kind of wonder if that line is going to come up when Jaime knights Brienne again. It's like, would you prefer to be dubbed as Sir Brienne or Lady Brienne? I think she's going to choose the Sir Brienne moniker.
I love that too, and I wonder if George is consciously reflecting that with Podrick. So maybe there'll be a cute moment where they realize they've both been kind of reaching the same conclusion about her in different ways. One thing Jaime mentions here, one thing he thinks to himself is that Tyrion's going to laugh himself sick to hear about Jaime's escape. But when they reunite at King's Landing, it's going to be Jaime helping Tyrion escape in his very last chapter in the book. It's Jaime who comes to Tyrion's cell.
And also this starts a continuing theme in this book with Tyrion and Jaime each thinking about how the other would handle whatever situation they're in and how they'd do it better. Like Jaime's thought that Tyrion could think of something clever now, but all that occurs to me is to go at them with a sword. And I wonder if just thinking about how Tyrion would mouth off gave him the inspiration for his humor during the boat chase. And I tell you what, I wish we'd gotten more happy time scenes between these two as a foundation for this just sort of hinted at relationship.
It's interesting. You get the sense that Tyrion said that Jaime was the only one who ever showed him any kindness, but I also get the sense that it was just very kind of casual, like affection, not like they didn't have deep conversations. And I think that's part of why Jaime ends up confessing the Tysha backstory to Tyrion, because he kind of realizes, oh, I've been nice to you, which no one else was, but I never really talked to you and tried to help you deal with the fact that the world is so shitty to you. And I'm going to try, and it's much too late.
Absolutely.
And backfires spectacularly.
Spectacularly. But you're right. We're kind of building up to that point because they've been thinking about each other all through the book, and then they meet handless and noseless, and then it goes horribly wrong.
Yeah.
So in terms of our theory and discussion portion of the episode, we hinted at a couple times earlier, but I wanted to ask you, Charlotte, to talk about Jaime and Brienne and kind of how you think about the relationship in terms of where you're coming from with your background in medieval studies.
Well, I think one of the reasons that I like Brienne so much, and I guess Jaime because he hangs out with her, and why I wanted to come on for this episode in particular, is how their stories, separately and together, have so much in common with medieval romances. And I don't mean capital R romance like Sir Walter Scott. I mean the romances like Chrétien de Troyes or Marie de France's Arthurian romances. George makes a big deal out of how chivalry is this great big lie that society tells itself to excuse all the violence, but he also managed to end up with some pretty solid medieval style storytelling. Because in the romances, the knights often have to go out questing to sort of find themselves, and we see that a lot with Jaime and Brienne. This chapter is just the start of these two learning things about each other, and chivalry and oath-keeping and the world in general while they're stomping around in the wilderness. And I have argued before that Jaime and Brienne in particular, and the way that they play off of each other, remind me a lot of Lancelot and Galahad. Partly because of how Brienne serves as an example to Jaime of how a knight should act, and he can't quite live up to her example because of his own internal flaws.
Yeah, I loved your points about Jaime Brienne's story fitting into true chivalry, TM, and specifically the Arthurian romance of it all. So, as you could probably tell, I was talked a lot about this earlier in the episode, but my question to you is, how do you think...
Uh-oh.
Oh no, Jeff's so frozen. Everyone just stare worshipfully at his handsome face until he returns to us. Everyone just admire his guns, etc.
Oh, here we go. I'm back. Here.
There he is.
Yeah.
All right, so I'll do it again. My question to you is, how does Cersei fit into all of this?
Well, as I briefly alluded to earlier, if we take Jaime as sort of a twisted Lancelot, Cersei's his Guinevere. Of course, that starts to get shaky when we actually get into Cersei's POV, because by herself, she isn't very Guinevere-y. But within Jaime's story, that's her role. Kind of like how I would argue that within Jaime's story, Brienne acts kind of as both a Galahad and Elaine figure. Elaine of Corbinic, not Elaine of Astolat. And I'm not going to get too far into that particular rabbit hole. But on her own, she's much more Galahad if he wasn't perfect to the point of being boring.
Have I returned?
Oh,
I'm sorry. I
hello.
apologize.
You're
No,
Feeling
all good,
issues of
bro.
Wi-Fi here. No worries. Okay, my question. Having listened to your recent Learned Hands episode, I wondered whether she is a gender-swapped
We'll get him there, folks. We'll get him there. I promise. People are saying
how
he's got
far to get that time
grayscale.
around. Oh, yeah, I've got the grayscale. All right, let's try it one more time.
You got it, buddy.
So having listened to your recent Learned Hands episode, I wondered whether she is a gender swap traditional knight, a sexually wanton knight, while Jaime remains the chaste damsel back home. Is that what's going on in the story?
Yeah. I think Cersei would like for that to be the case, but Jaime definitely does more questing while Cersei has to stay home and do the politics until they don't let her anymore.
It's interesting to me that you have this kind of trying to decouple the courtly elements from the sexual elements, because Jaime and Brienne do have that kind of a more kind of the chaste elements of the romance, with the actual sexuality kind of displaced onto Cersei. And it does feel to me like at some level Jaime wishes he could combine these two women. Like that would be the ideal for him. Is if he could force Brienne and Cersei into like the Machine from the Fly or something and just make himself this, because like that would be for him kind of the ideal. And I wonder if what George is trying to do is make that romantic ideal impossible for Jaime by splitting it into two people and saying you can either have your traditionally beautiful a woman with who you've been obsessed with in your part, or you can be with the person who makes you feel like a true knight. But these are antithetical, and I think that's really interesting.
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too. I think it's a great topic, and of course, you did write an essay about this, didn't you? Or on your blog?
I wrote a 3-part essay on this. I had a lot of thoughts.
What's it called?
The blog or the essay, or both?
The essay, so we can let the people know who are watching or listening.
It was, what did I call it? Jaime, Brienne, Arthuriana, and Romance, I believe is what I called it.
Yeah, it's an excellent essay, worth checking out. So it's interesting. I think George does a great job of like integrating a lot of these like 17th, 18th century, 19th century romantic and chivalric undertones to his plots in A Song of Ice and Fire. But he also, like you're saying, integrates the traditional medieval storytelling dynamics and tropes into the story, which I think makes for a fuller, excellent story, especially when it comes to a character like Jaime Lannister, of course, is the best character in all of Song of Ice and Fire, fiction everywhere. just
one of those questions. One of those questions that I would definitely ask George if I had a chance was, which medieval literature is he actually familiar with? Because I can definitely see Mallory, but then it's like, do we get into Marie de France, or like how deep do we go here with his knowledge of medieval literature?
Yep. I would be curious about that question. Next time you see George, make sure you ask him.
Just run into him in the Publix.
Of course, that's where he's at. The Publix there. So I think that is going to wrap us up for this analysis on A Storm of Swords, Jaime 1. As always, thank you so much to everyone for listening. Thank you to those of you who've been watching us on our live streams. Those are our first public live streams, so we appreciate you all coming in, tuning in for that. If you have the chance, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, Podbean, Spotify, anywhere and everywhere where you find our podcast.
You can check out our Patreon at patreon.com/notacastASOIAF. You can follow us on Twitter at notacastASOIAF, or shoot us an email at notacastASOIAF@gmail.com. You can find me at Port Quentin on Twitter.
And you can find me at Brendan Beefish on Twitter, Brendan Beefish on Reddit, and our website is brendanbeefish.substack.com.
We want to shout out and thank our high lords and ladies on Patreon. Red Relu himself, who has renounced his allegiance to the Squishers. Lady of a Thousand Words. Septon Marybald, the Shoeless Sage. Sister Winter, Lady of the Wolfswood. Nessie the Elusive, Warden of the Neck, Defender of the North, and Keeper of Secrets. Sir Thomas the Raven Knight, Lord of Blackwood. Sir Way, of course. Matt, Warden of the Sanguine Shore. Lord Sam K. Wisdom Benjicut, Alchemist of Sets and Quanta, Mage of the Arts of Bulin de Morgan. Tibbs the Great of House Catnapping. Lord J. Manderley, Baker of the Frey Pies, Septon, Merriful Head of Hair, Lady Silverwing, Caboth the Unfrozen, Lord of the Bricks and Castle Crimson Light, Sir Keith of House Corbray, Wielder of Lady Forlorn, Lord Andrew, Warden of the Dubai Sands, Lord Young of the Ghostwoods, Lady Mira Reed, Wielder of Dark Sister, Slayer of Tinfoil, Sir Will of the Anarcho-Syndicalist Commune, Lord Clay, Sir Small Paul, Guardian of the Stonehaven, Defender of Dunatar Castle, Septon T-Bone, the Low Septon, Refined Wrangler of Icy Arachnids, Lady Veronica, who was abandoned the orphans at the end of the Crossroads to become the Queen of Memes, Lady Danielle of House Lannister, Titanium Pirate, Lady Joan, Lady Ranger of the Frostfangs, Sydney of House Quo, Princess of the Friendly Black Hotties in the Summer Isles, Random, Fierce Protector of Cripples, Bastards, and Broken Things, Sir Lady Jordan, Defender of the God's Eye, Lord Peter, not Peter, Drinker of Strong Wine and Lord Commander of the Flat Planeto Society, Lady of Rainy Afternoons, Warden of the Lake, and Lady Ken of House Motown, Goddess of Sips and Wine. Thank you so much, as always, to all our high lords and ladies for your support.
Yeah, thank you folks so very much. We really, really appreciate your support. So join us next week as we check in with Catelyn Stark, who, as it turns out, is not having a good time at all back at River Run. Poor Catelyn. This is
Who could have expected that from this chapter? Right? Who could have seen that coming?
Right? No, but things are going to get better, right? After Catelyn 1, it just gets successfully better. You start at a low point.
Oh, sure. That's the low point.
Oh, boy. Poor Catelyn. Poor mom. So thank you so much for joining us. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you to Shiloh for joining us. And we'll see you next time for A Storm of Swords, Catelyn 1.
Woohoo.
All right.
Awesome. Thanks again.
And we are stopping recording, yes?
Yes, indeed.
Yes. All right, cool.
Beautiful.
Man, first Jaime chapter. Crazy, huh?
Meet your expectations, sir? Is it good to be with your boyfriend again?
Oh, yes, it is. Yes,
good.
It is.
I'm sure he was waiting for you, eagerly, no doubt.
And yes.
Jaime chapters weren't canonical until Jeff got his hands on them.
Now the first one is. We got the remaining 8
we got to canonize the rest.
That's right. That's right. If you guys want to stay on, I unfortunately have to drop off for this call, sadly.
No, of course, brother. Given the time.
Yeah.
But I do have to sign off. Shiloh, it was really good to see you. Good to finally do a podcast with you.
Absolutely.
Of course.
Sorry for all the audio, video issues and everything like that.
Oh, shush.
It's just annoying to me, like, it's on the perfectionist level. So, but yeah.
I get you, but hey, we got through the bulk of the episode before it even happened, and it only happened a couple times, so we're just fine.
That's true.
Just fine and dandy. Well, everyone wave to Jeff. Everyone,
bye, Jeff.
Everyone, make air kisses or whatever it is you do when Jeff leaves the room.
How many people go, pew?
Whew, exactly.
He's gone now. We can say bad stuff about him. No,
that's right. That Jeff asshole. Who needs him? He's so Jaime Lannister-esque. I might stick around and answer a couple questions for folks in the chat if they want to just hang out with people. You're welcome to, Shiloh, if you want.
Yeah,
but I know you got classes and such.
Yeah, gotta be up at 6 a.m.
I hear you.
Yeah, but yeah, I can hang out for a bit.
Okay. Guilty Undertaker asked, when and why do you think George decided to have Euron and not Jaime be the main human villain of the series? I think kind of as it happens.
Yeah.
I think once you get away from Jaime and once you're trying to figure out how to execute the White Walker stuff, I think he kind of worked backwards towards Euron from the realization that I think I need a guy for this.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think it kind of developed from there. I never thought of that's an interesting thing to think about, just between those two, especially since they end up fighting in the show. I'm the villain. No, I'm the villain. No, I love Cersei. That's what all that was about.
But it's still interesting that you can kind of see, I guess we project backstory onto it, where we're like, well, if you look at the Bran chapters, it's totally there. And
right.
maybe not. Maybe we just see it because we've got that whole chunk of story now. But I mean, maybe he put that there just in case he needed something later.
For sure. I mean, you
We'll
see
never
bits of
know.
Euron in the second book and in the third, but yeah, I think by the time you get to Feast, he's moved the narrative in a direction where he needs someone more major in that part of the story.
Yeah.
And Jaime's off on his own gambit for sure. What else we got from Jake Sunland? If you could replace any one character in Game of Thrones, the TV show. Oh, he retracted it. He was going to say, who would it be and why would it be Stannis? Yeah, I mean, Stannis on the show is really frustrating because it's Stephen Delane is very good. All the actors are good. The score is great. The set of Dragonstone is great, but there's just no structure to it. Like every time you just check in, it's like, oh, Stannis is creeping closer to doing the thing he's probably gonna do, and it's like the really in Storm. I love those Davos chapters because it's very built beat by beat to get Stannis towards Edric Storm and then towards the wall, and that's the fun of it. So I
think it says something about the book writing where in the show he's like totally burning Shireen, and so many people went, oh, he would never.
Right.
And then you read back and go, oh.
He would always.
Maybe,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, because there wasn't like he was always, and there was I think a version of this with Dany too, where people would point to previous things Dany had done on the show and say, see, she was always going there. And I think that's true to a certain extent, but it just didn't feel like a build-up. It just felt like a lot of things happening and then more things happen. And I think it's, there's something to be said for the very kind of scrupulous kind of moral descent that you see, I think, with some of the book characters. I think it's smoother. Oh, replacing a character with a Muppet was the question. Who would it be and why is it Stannis? So that's a much better question. Replace one character in Game of Thrones with a Muppet. What do you think, Charlotte? Who would be best?
Walder Frey.
Oh, that's great. He's almost already there. You just shrink him a bit. He can keep that voice.
On. Yeah.
I just see like the hand is visible under the Frey table and all his sons are pretending not to see it.
Yeah.
That would be wonderful. I would love to see Olenna as a Muppet as well. She could just get like the Miss Piggy wigs. I think that would be wonderful. Warren asked what you think about any Celtic influences in Bran's story.
Well, there's the Fisher King stuff. Obviously,
Sure.
Y'all have talked about that before. If you want details, I'd have to do some research.
Well, Warren, pony up for some research.
Subscribe to my Patreon. I'm joking. I don't have a Patreon.
Just for these kind of questions. Frank, a better question. Replace every character but one with Muppets. That's also interesting. That would be fun if it was just Stannis and a bunch of Muppets.
Yeah.
That would be a wonderful, wonderful, enjoyable time. Anyone who takes themselves seriously plus a bunch of Muppets is comedy gold. But, Tywin plus a bunch of Muppets, also very funny.
Although I could see Stannis being played by what's his name, the Eagle, Sam the Eagle.
Sam the Eagle, that'd be perfect. Tall, same face, just a big frown with a pair of eyebrows on top of it. Yeah. That's about perfect.
Jon Snow as a non-Muppet works well too. Yeah,
yeah,
that would be hilarious.
Exactly. That's how he feels. That's just how he feels. Like everyone else is a Muppet all the time. That's the character of Kenneth on 30 Rock when it goes into his vision and he sees everyone as a Muppet that's always just dancing around and singing a theme song. So that's just why he's happy all the time. It would just be that. Max L asks, does Kat have an Arthurian analog in Jaime's story? What do you think about that?
George has come out and said that she's Arthur's mom.
Sure. Okay. So that would be kind of
that one's really.
If Arthur's mom,
if she'd lived and people cared anything about her,
if she was involved in the nightly politics of the Round Table, yeah, that's about right. That's interesting. If she insisted on meddling with their stories, that's great. While I'm here, I'm gonna just DM you the drive link.
Yeah, let me, I guess, export this sucker.
Yes, indeedy.
MP3 or?
Yes, indeed, if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, it is.
Just being all apologetic in the DMs. Oh, Jeff. Whenever like a small thing goes wrong, he makes it into a big thing that is about how he is a bad person. And I make fun of that, but I do the same thing. I often catch myself doing that. We're like,
Aaron is asking about my Neil Gaiman thing. My Neil Gaiman thing is a book. It is called When Shadow Meets Grendel, the Medievalisms and the Works of Neil Gaiman. It is expected out fall 2023.
Woo!
I have not yet seen Green Knight, but I want to.
Oh, people talking Green Knight. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a movie where I was like, it would have been like good to talk to someone who knows their stuff medieval wise afterwards, because I was like, this is great, but I can feel things going over my head. You know that feeling when it's like that. I know that means a thing, and I'm not smart enough to know what it means.
That's in the poem somewhere, isn't it?
Exactly. That's a reference. It's being lingered on too much to not be a reference. But I enjoy that feeling, because that when your brain can figure out enough that something's important, and so I really enjoyed it. I would love to know what you think if you get the chance to see it, for sure. I definitely recommend it to fantasy fans in general.
It's probably going to end up being one of those things I have to get on Blu-ray or whatever when it comes out.
Sure,
so it'll be a bit.
It got a lot of hype, but I'm sure it'll come out soon.
But yeah, I'm not going to a theater, so that's where we are.
Can't blame you. Can't blame you one bit. Lo asks, I know Shiloh loves Brienne. I'd love to hear more about why. Well, we got. If you got all night.
Really? How many chats are you in with me where I'm constantly talking about why I love Brienne?
I know. I saw that. I was like, is this really a mystery? Is some big untapped mystery?
Because she is perfect and wonderful and the best thing ever. That's why.
I love it. It's true. It's true. I look forward to. Her chapters in Feast are very special. I look forward to those. I'm enjoying the Jaime ones. I enjoy kind of a ironic shoot from the hip way, but those Brienne ones, that's like those are art. Can't wait. Well, folks, we got any other questions you want to throw at us? Anything else? Any deep any insults about Jeff? Any deep mysteries to plumb before we say sayonara? Frank says Brienne on the Quiet Owl is the best monologue in the books, and that's true. That is a great one. She's talking about her dad.
Yeah,
that is a beautiful scene.
And like so many things, the show cheated us out of it.
It's true. It's true. You could see Gwendolyn Christie nailing it.
Oh, she would have killed it. It would have been amazing.
Oh, that's true. What a shame. Oh, Eric says something nice about my Lord of the Rings recaps. Thank you so much. Ryan
actually got me reading the books again, so.
Well, thank you. High compliment.
I was like, I guess I should read these.
Well, glad to contribute to everyone's reading list. That's certainly everyone.
Because they're one of those things where I keep going, I should read these again. Like I should. And then going, There's so much description. There's so much description of the woods. I don't know if I can wade through that. And then I read them again. I'm like, it's not nearly as bad as I remembered. Like,
once you have
these are some pretty woods, and then you keep going. Yeah.
Once you have a sense of it. But yeah, I do remember the first time through, I just feel like it's like we're spending a fortnight camping here and a fortnight camping there. And we have a song about the fortnight we've spent camping. I do remember as a kid being like, when do we get to the fireworks factory? About Lord of the Rings a lot. But I had a blast doing those. So that was fun. Ryan asked, does this take place before the Blackwater? Jeff had mentioned George's little caveat in chronology at the start of this book where it says the first few chapters take place like at the same time as or right before the Blackwater. So I think, roughly in chronology. About that time. Well, all right. I think that'll probably wrap us up for the night, folks. I'll go let Chloe and the cats be free. She might be asleep, though, because usually she lets the cats out when we're done doing the proper recording, and she didn't. So I'm going to go in there, and she's going to be asleep, and the cats will be guarding her, looking at me like, what? We weren't just selling her blood for profit. What are you looking at us for? Little demons. But thanks again, Charlotte. I had such a good time doing our medieval episode, and we're looking forward to having you for this one. So we'll have to do it again.
Maybe when we get to Brienne.
Exactly. That'll be perfect. If not before then we will absolutely do it then.
All right.
Awesome. Well, thanks for watching again, everyone. Thanks for your questions. And we're going to be coming back same time-ish on Monday, same time. I don't know if it's going to be the exact if at 8:30 or 9, and we'll be doing Catelyn 1, whose chapters I love even more. So we will see you then.